Today I'll be ranking all bosses and all mini-bosses in Atomic Heart and giving some ideas on how to fix them if they're bad. Before I start, I want to say that I was playing on the hardest difficulty, so if you don't have the same experience with certain bosses, consider playing on Armageddon for a bit. The very first boss or mini-boss you will encounter is the Laser Vova. And I know that's not his name, but calling him Black Vova sounds kind of bad for YouTube, so I will stick to Laser Vova. This is a regular version of a Vova robot, but it has an extra laser attack. Because of that, you already know most of his moveset, and the new laser attacks are easily predictable and dodgeable. Sometimes, if you don't take your time with him, he might do a combo that you can't dodge, but that's because you didn't manage your dodge abilities well enough, and because at this point in the game, you don't have anything that can help you get rid of them with ease. But I feel like this is a great elite enemy that is quite fair and doesn't pose that much of a problem later in the game once you get more cool weapons and upgrades. And even at the beginning of the game he doesn't feel too hard, and despite his health, doesn't seem like a bullet sponge because you get to see all his attacks and not get bored. 8 Soviet stars out of 10, because they become very easy when you upgrade your weapons. The next mini-boss I nearly forgot about. Seriously, do you even remember this dude? But yeah, it's basically a mutant, but that speaks. Yeah, that's all. This boss isn't even a boss. The real threat in this arena are all the other enemies. The only reason why this fight is hard because the game throws a bunch of mutants, flying exploding flowers, and the things that pump out these flowers. The boss on its own, as I said, is just a normal enemy. Actually, I'm not sure. You see, the problem with this boss is his weak spot. The weak spots on the back of the enemy are good and very popular in many games because you have to adapt to the situation and somehow get around the boss, which makes the fight more interesting and more intense. But in Atomic Heart, we have the Frostbite Plasmid that freezes enemies in place, allowing to completely ignore this boss and immediately take out half of his health. And even if you don't damage his weak spot, he still takes a lot of damage and dies in a matter of seconds. He doesn't even feel like an elite enemy at this point. 3 mutant flower thingies out of 10. The boss is too easy even on the hardest difficulty, and you can't see his attacks because of how fast he dies. But it can speak when you damage it, which is cool, I guess. Lore. Now let's move to actual bosses. The Hawk 7 or the Hedgie boss is the first actual boss you will encounter in game, and she is amazing. Now this is a real boss. She might seem hard at first, but her attacks are pretty easy to dodge if you've seen them before and memorize the pattern. Yes, you will die quite a few times, but the boss presentation isn't too long, so you don't get bored like in some other instances, but we'll get to them later. The boss looks and attacks very well. It has this perfect balance between long multi-attack combos and small pauses during which the boss is cooling off and you can input some damage. I actually really like this system where you have to dodge for a long time, but then you are rewarded with the ability to deal lots of damage really quick. I also like that all attacks aren't obvious how to dodge. For example, the range attack anticipates your movement, so if you run in circles around the boss, you will most likely die. But if you actually stand still and take your time to analyze the situation, this attack becomes very easy to complete without taking any damage. The boss is very fair, and if you die, you can only blame yourself. All attacks are understandable, but still require concentration in order to complete them. So if you start panicking or lose your rhythm, so to speak, you will die, and that's what I like about this boss. It can forgive you a couple of mistakes, but not too many.
And the only attack that is genuinely problematic and that might seem unfair can be cancelled using your mass telekinesis skill. This actually reminds me of Elden Ring in some sort. These small interactions the game doesn't tell you about, but if you experiment and use logic, you'll get a great reward for figuring this out. Or you can watch my 100 Atomic Heart Facts video, just saying. Also, I like that there is an alternative and more risky method to damage the boss when he's attacking. For example, you can shoot her weak spots when the Hawk 7 does its ranged attack, but there is a risk of you not paying attention to the projectiles and getting hit. Or the statue interaction, where you can make the boss run into the statue and take damage, which again requires a bit of risk because you have to position yourself into a special spot, which can be hard when dodging the numerous attacks the boss throws at you. The only problem I have with this boss fight is that it's too short. I mean, you deal lots of damage and certain combo attacks aren't long enough. My final verdict is 9 iron balls out of 10 because I just wish this boss had even more and longer attacks, but it's very good. Our next stop will be the vdnh, with probably the biggest bullet sponge in the history of video games. Now, before you start spamming comments at me, I want to say that I know that different enemies and bosses have different weaknesses, but even if I use an AK-47 with the appropriate cartridges, it will still deal a very small amount of damage compared to this boss's health. For you to understand, at the very beginning of the fight, I had a lot of ammo, but at the end of the boss fight, I had no ammo left for every single gun in my inventory, and I had to resort into running around in circles and waiting for my energy to regenerate. Now, you will probably ask me, why didn't I use melee weapons? This boss is really weak to them. Well, that's because enemies that are weak to melee are usually very strong in melee, and that is exactly the current case. Ivy's attacks are very hard to read. You don't really understand when the boss will make his hands 5 times longer and hit you at the other side of the arena, or just do a regular attack. All of his animations consist of the same action, swing his arms into a random direction. Also, this boss deals a lot of damage. One hit is enough to put you into critical state, which is very scary if you consider that pretty much every single attack he executes will make you fall to the ground. Melee combat isn't an option with this boss because of how risky and scary it is, especially if you consider the fact that the boss fight is so long. Seriously, it took me 30 minutes to beat this boss. And if you don't believe me or you wanna see the entire 30-minute boss fight, you can always go on my second channel where I upload daily Atomic Heart videos. The link is in the description. Don't get me wrong, I like hard and long boss encounters, but not when it's made by extending the boss's health to insane numbers. But by implementing interesting and unique mechanics you have to work with in order to win. Or another alternative would have been to take the large mutant's weak spot and put it on this boss. So using up all the extra ammo you have will be your choice, and not because someone accidentally added an extra 0 to the boss health values. 4 bloody polymer out of 10. Make the boss have less health or add a weak spot, make the attacks more readable and varied, maybe something that actually shows that this boss is made from polymer and uses it in combat, or even make this boss have the polymer jet ability, mimicking the player's one, like some sort of Uno reverse card. I just don't like the fact that this boss is basically just a red Chewbacca that can only swing his arms and nothing else. Or maybe I just want too much from a mini-boss encounter. Moving on to yet another story boss, the Belash. Before I start talking about this boss, I just want to say that the game already spoils him for you. And I'm not talking about the trailers, no, I mean that in the game you can actually find hidden areas where you can fight them, which I find quite strange because the laser Vova, for example, appeared as an elite enemy only after you beat his boss version. But because I was completing all side areas and exploring everything in the world, I managed to defeat 4 Belashes before the actual real version. I don't really like this approach because this unique boss becomes just an elite enemy by the time you get to him, although his moveset is a bit more varied compared to the others, which actually kinda works better because you think that, oh, you know this boss so well, but then you get hit by a new move. But speaking of his attacks, I can say that they're pretty good. I actually think that in terms of readable and understandable attacks, this boss is one of the best. You can understand when the boss is preparing to make a heavy attack, but you don't actually know what. And this brings fear and tension while you're waiting for the boss to actually do something. Or maybe this will even make you dodge earlier, wasting your dodge ability and getting hit after, which is really cool. The only ranged attack this boss has is the rock throw, and despite how predictable it is, it can still catch you off guard if you're not careful. I also like how the Belash jumps around, which makes you look up and change the flow of your combat. Actually, I really like how this boss changes in his second phase. It becomes more aggressive and way faster, which requires you to change your playstyle and become more careful because the floor becomes littered with lots of fire, which is always a nice addition. But as I said, the real encounter is overshadowed by the fact that you've already seen this boss and know most of his attacks. But this also adds an element of surprise to new attacks. I'm not sure, I would say 8 floor is lava games out of 10. Yet another boss that you will encounter in the theater is Ivy again, but this time he is actually good. The boss doesn't feel like a bullet sponge, no actually scratch that, but it feels better because at this point in the game you have all the tools needed to defeat this boss. The Fat Boy that is very effective, and the upgraded telekinesis skill that, paired with your new powerful melee weapons, works very well. But the boss still eats a lot of Fat Boy rockets. I also like how the boss has a second phase, which drastically changes his style. I didn't mention this, but the first time you encounter this boss, he just doesn't change at all. Instead of a hard-hitting melee enemy, the boss becomes a ranged AoE attacker that tries to stay away from you. The fight is still quite long and there are flying enemies everywhere that make you have a hard time. Actually, I looked at the official wiki and apparently he gains this second phase if he interacts with a sprout, which is even better. I just love little interactions between enemies like this. It just brings the game's world more alive. And also, if you die during this boss, you have to re-unlock the door puzzle, which is quite annoying. But it was better than last time. 5 door locks that take me 20,000 years to solve out of 10. The final boss in the theater is Natasha, and it's a good boss. There is a bit of bullet eating going on, but the Fat Boy can easily fix it. All the attacks are readable and understandable except for this spinning one, because I have no idea what to do with this. Also, I like how the rockets that she is shooting anticipate your movement, and I always dodge in their direction but still manage to not get hit. Another move that I love is when she flies up and then drops these exploding mines. Just like the Belash boss, while you're waiting for the attack to strike, there is this fear of the unknown that builds up. Also, I think these bomb balls thingies are very hard to dodge. If they hit you, they explode, so we have to shoot them, but because they jump around so much, it's very hard to hit them, and even if you do, because they explode, they push other mines away, making it even harder to dodge. This attack is just really hard. And the size of this arena doesn't quite fit. Seriously, why does this giant 500 kilogram piece of metal is in an arena that is smaller than the Belash arena? For example, the Natasha fight in one of the testing grounds feels much better. Even despite the fact that in the testing ground there are lots of drones with lasers that shoot you from every angle. Also, I find it kinda sad that this boss has only 4 attacks and no quick moves that utilize the weight and round shape of the boss. Imagine how cool it would be if instead of 2 rocket barrages, there were multiple of them. Or if Natasha would roll towards you like Godric from Elden Ring and then jump down. 8 Natasha Sims out of 10. Normally the next boss is the Dewdrop, but can we talk about how many IVs there are in this endgame? I've defeated one on the bridge, and then there's another one, and once I've defeated him, there's another one in the hospital, and then another one in the testing ground. That is 4. Okay, not counting the testing ground, 3 bosses back to back you have to defeat. And I know you can just run away, but still. This is so bad, especially if you consider the fact that they don't change at all, and they still have a lot of health. I want you to understand that I'm not mad because these bosses are repeated. For example, the Vova mini-boss is a good elite enemy, and I'm okay to fight him over and over again, because he has interesting attacks. So, if I had to identify the worst boss in this game, this will probably be Ivy. Although there is another boss that could very well take this title. Yes, I'm talking about the Dewdrop. First and foremost, it is obvious that a boss is going to be here. All other bosses except for the Belash were not obvious. It was an actual surprise when the Natasha dropped from the sky or when Ivy came from a corner in the theater. You didn't know there was a boss, and it made it even more interesting because you weren't prepared. Here I immediately understood that something fishy was going on, so I took my time to stock up on resources, and this boss was very easy for me. But now let's talk about the actual attack patterns. When I first saw this boss, I thought, wow, this is going to be an upgraded version of the Haji. But in reality it turned out to be complete garbage. The only, and I mean the only thing this boss uses to attack is the laser, which is quite sad, but you can still make some interesting attacks with this laser, so let's see. Regular fire like the Vova mini-boss, okay. Long fire like the regular ranged attack of Vovas, okay. And that's pretty much it. Yes, in his second phase he gains tentacles that give him 1 extra attack, but this is just sad that compared to other bosses that completely change, this boss has 1 new attack, that's all? And even his laser isn't original, it's just Vova's laser with a bigger hitbox. You could have made so many things. First, make him use his mechanical tentacles, like the Haji boss or the Belash. Also add actually interesting laser attacks, like the Ballerina twins. They have this laser phase where they are invincible and you have to dodge for a long time. This is a good attack. It utilizes the all-known lasers but puts them into a different setting and situation, making it more interesting and engaging. Why didn't this boss have any combos? Like, I don't know, make him jump in the air and spin his laser around the player while slowly making the radius smaller. Why can I make up interesting attacks and the devs can't? I'm especially mad because in the lore, this boss is supposed to be one of the strongest robots in the entire USSR, and he doesn't even have any original attacks. Don't get me wrong, copy-paste isn't bad. 90% of Elden Ring bosses are copy-paste, but they're still interesting because their attacks are still a bit different, which gives an element of surprise, the same thing in the Belash fight, for example, and it gives some sort of nostalgia, which will work very good in a game like Atomic Heart that is entirely based on nostalgia and remembering the old days, so to speak. But I'm just sad that a boss with such an interesting and rich concept turned out to be a copy-paste. 4 whales out of 10, only because the lore is good and the boss looks cool, otherwise it would be like a 2 or something. And now it is time for the grand finale, the Ballerina twins. This boss fight is divided into 2 sections. The first section is when you fight left alone, and the second one is the double boss. Let's talk about the first phase. I really like it, the attacks are understandable and fair to dodge. I also like the fact that if you don't deal enough damage, she will go into this some sort of demon mode, where she starts behaving like some sort of spider, which looks quite creepy, and again, the second phase of the boss changes his moveset completely, which I really like. Especially because the Ballerina switches between these 2 phases all the time, which makes the fight even more interesting. Another feature I really like is how this boss counterattacks to your most powerful abilities, because if I use the Master Telekinesis skill, which is the most OP ability in the entire game, when I drop her, she will create this shockwave which makes the fight harder. Basically, you now have a choice to either do a heavy damage attack, but to make the fight more difficult, or take more time to kill the boss, but don't take as much risk. Now let's move to the double boss fight. I was very skeptical about this from the very beginning. To be honest, I was expecting something like the Godskins from Elden, but I got the Gargoyles from Dark Souls. This what a double boss fight should look like in every game. There is one strong, hyper-aggressive attacker and a second ranged AoE unit that is always somewhere in the background. But this doesn't mean that you can completely forget about her, because she will still attack you, not as aggressively as the melee counterpart, but you still have to shift your focus from time to time to see what she is doing. And this is what I love about this boss fight, that you have to analyze the position and attacks of both bosses in order to succeed. But now let's talk about the actual boss attacks. If you watched my 100 facts video, you will know that I've made a hypothesis that the ballerinas will have the same abilities as the player because their hands look like and behave like P3's glove. And I was right. I really like when bosses use your attacks because it kinda gives you a taste of your own medicine, because instead of lifting up your enemies using kinesis, you're the one getting lifted up and damaged. Although not all abilities of the glove are used by the twins. The Frostbite and Polymeric Shield are missing, which is quite sad, because it would have been very interesting to see a ballerina pull up a shield that reflects your bullets back at you, so you have to react quickly. The telekinesis skill I mentioned earlier was also changed. So instead of getting smashed to the ground, you get only lifted, which I find quite unfortunate because it would make this attack actually dangerous if she was smashing you to the ground and you had to take time to get up. Also during this fight I've noticed that some moves like the spider one disappeared in this fight, which is quite sad, but I understand that this was made to, well, make the fight less overwhelming. Although the moveset of this phase is very good, as it has many combo attacks just like the Haji boss. Another interesting feature I've noticed is the laser attack, where the two twins work together in order to create this laser grid. I really like when enemies interact and become more powerful with the help of other enemies. But unfortunately, this is the only instance of an attack where the two are working together, which is quite sad because it would have been very cool to see them do combo attacks. And yet another great move I've seen is how left backs off really fast. I just adore when bosses randomly gain a giant boost in speed and go to the other side of the arena or come really close to you, because it makes the fight way more interesting and also way more scarier. Overall, the boss is really nice and quite hard, but not completely overwhelming. The developers did a great job to make a good and balanced double boss fight. But just like with the Hedgie boss, it's so good I want more. I want to see more moves for the fight to be longer. Speaking of which, the battle wasn't too long, but I didn't like the fact that when you scanned them, there were no vulnerabilities and nearly no resistances, which, if there were any, could have made this fight more interesting. But even without this, the fight is still very good. And the fact that this fight was overshadowed from the very beginning is very cool. Soon I will make a review of Atomic Heart where I will explain all this in great detail, but for now I will give this 10 hot robo-mummies out of 10. Overall, the bosses are quite good, but the only really interesting and hard bosses were the Haji and the twins. I know it might sound strange that I want these bosses to be similar to ones from the Souls games, but the game is actually quite similar to Elden Ring and Doom, but this is a topic for another video.